Darkness in Maplewood, Vermont, was not merely the absence of light. It was a living entity, heavy and frigid, wrapping the small town in its embrace like an old mother tucking a child into an eternal hibernation. It was 3:30 in the morning. Outside the window, the world remained a deep, bruised indigo, silent enough that one could almost hear the snowflakes brushing against the glass. A whispering static of secrets never told. In the small bedroom on the attic floor above Martha's hearth, Martha opened her eyes. She had no need for an alarm clock. For 50 years, her circadian rhythm had been hardwired to the fermentation cycle of wheat flour and the cooling curve of cast iron. She lay still for a few seconds, listening to the breathing of the old house. The timber contracting in the cold, the wind whistling through the sash, and more importantly, the absolute silence of a new day not yet stained by the noise of traffic or worldly anxieties. Martha slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the freezing wooden floorboards, yet she did not shiver. This cold was part of the ritual, a reminder that she was alive, existing on the frontier of this stillness. She pulled a thick, ash-gray wool cardigan over her shoulders, secured her silver hair into a tight bun with a simple wooden clip, and descended the creaking stairs straight into the heart of the house. The kitchen. The moment the kitchen door swung open, a pocket of warm air, carrying the lingering ghost of yeast and vanilla from the day before, rushed to meet her. This was Martha's kingdom. No, more accurately, this was her sanctuary. It was a space of roughly 400 square feet defined by red brick walls smoked dark by time and solid oak tables with corners rounded smooth by a million collisions with a baker's hip. In the center of the room, looming like an ancient deity, stood the cast iron oven. It was black, heavy, and imposing, the kind of machine people called a relic of the last century. But to her, it was the soul of Martha's hearth. Martha approached the oven and twisted the gas knob. With a soft whoosh, a blue flame erupted, licking the bottom of the chamber, chasing away the winter chill. She placed her hand on the oven's lid, feeling the heat bleed through the cold metal, a handshake between two old friends. "Good morning, old boy," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "We have a lot to do today." She began her work with the precision of a veteran concert pianist. There was no wasted motion. She didn't need a digital scale to measure the flour for the first batch of sandwich bread. Her hands, webbed with wrinkles, spotted with age, and knuckles slightly swollen from arthritis, glided over the wooden surface. She plunged her hands into the sack of white flour, gauging its humidity. The air was dry today. The dough would need water. Just a touch, perhaps 20 milliliters more. She knew this not from a recipe book, but from the sensation at her fingertips, a specific intuition forged over 10,000 hours at the bench. The sound of flour hitting the table echoed, thud, thud, a steady heartbeat. Martha created a small well in the center of the mound and cracked the eggs. The yolks were fresh, deep orange, sliding from their shells to rest in the white cradle. She began to knead. This was the moment she loved most, the physical connection between the artisan and the element. As her palm pressed down, the dough pushed back, elastic, alive. She closed her eyes, letting muscle memory take the wheel. For a brief, suspended moment, the space around her seemed to dissolve. She was no longer a 78-year-old woman in a remote corner of Vermont. The hum of the ventilation fan transformed into the rotor wash of Marine One landing on the south lawn. The smell of raw flour mingled with the scent of expensive perfume from diplomatic wives. The clinking of prep bowls became the silver cutlery of a state dinner. She recalled the suffocating pressure of constructing a 7-foot croquembouche for the Christmas of 1985, the scrutinizing glare of the press corps, and the president's discreet, respectful nod when he tasted the first bite of her sponge cake. But then, the distant rumble of a snowplow dragged her back to reality. The glittering images of Washington vanished like soap bubbles. Here she was just Martha, and she preferred it that way, in D.C. She baked to impress, to wield the soft power of a nation. Here she baked to nourish. The difference lay in the intent. As the first batch of bread went into the oven, the scent in the air began to shift. The sharp tang of yeast gave way to the sweet, caramelized aroma of baking starch and browning butter. It was the scent of comfort, the scent of family. The sun began to breach the horizon, casting weak, pale rays through the heavy mist, illuminating the flour dust floating in the air, turning the particles into suspended gold. At exactly 7 o'clock, the wind chime above the front door sang out a cheerful ling-ling. The heavy oak door pushed open, ushering in a gust of freezing wind and a familiar figure. Henry Henderson, 82, the town's former mayor, shuffled in, his wool hat pulled down over his ears and his rubber boots caked in snow. "Good morning, Queen of Flour," Henry boomed, his voice resonating in the warm space. He stomped his feet on the mat to shake off the snow and headed straight for his usual table by the faux fireplace. "Your coffee is ready, Henry," Martha said without turning around, her hands deftly arranging golden croissants onto the display tray. "And I put a little extra cinnamon in the cinnamon roll today. You should try it. It's good for your joints." Henry chuckled, easing himself into the chair, sighing with relief as the bakery's warmth wrapped around him. "You always know what I need before I do, Martha. Sometimes I wonder if you're a baker or the fairy godmother of this town." Martha offered a faint smile, placing the steaming black coffee in front of him. "Just an old woman playing with dough, Henry. Don't overstate it." The morning passed as smoothly as pouring honey. The regulars trickled in. Mary, the schoolteacher, bought oatmeal cookies for the kindergartners. Joe, the young police officer, stopped by for 2 glazed donuts and a double espresso. Mrs. Smith, the widow from the end of the street, came for a baguette and stayed for 15 minutes just to tell Martha about her sick cat. Martha listened to them all. She spoke little, offering only nods, smiles, or quiet words of comfort. She knew the secrets of this town by the pastries they chose. The sad ones picked the soft, cream-filled, overly sweet treats, as if trying to fill a void. The anxious, hurried ones grabbed the hard, crunchy items they could eat on the run. Her bakery didn't just sell food. It was an emotional way station, a place where people recharged their souls before facing the harsh world outside. By 10 o'clock, the sun had climbed higher, melting the thin layer of ice on the windows. The rush had slowed. Martha took the opportunity to polish the glass display case. She loved looking at her creations through the clear glass. The lemon tart glowing yellow, the opera cake with its glossy dark chocolate layers, and the cream puffs sitting round and perfect like little clouds. They weren't ornate. They lacked the frantic floral decorations of New York or Paris patisseries, but they possessed the beauty of truth. Suddenly, the ground trembled. At first, Martha thought it was the town plow passing by again. But this sound was different. It was a guttural roar, sharper and more aggressive. The noise grew louder, drowning out the soft jazz playing from the old radio. Henry Henderson, still reading his paper in the corner, looked up, frowning at the window. A truck, sleek, obsidian black, and as large as an armored beast, slowly rolled onto the narrow street in front of the shop. On its side, the words "Kitchens of America" were painted in a violent, slashing red font, stark against the black background. Trailing it were 2 black SUVs with tinted windows so dark they swallowed the light. The convoy halted directly in front of Martha's hearth, dominating the sidewalk and blocking the sunlight that had been streaming into the shop. The engines cut, leaving behind a terrifying silence, a stark contrast to the peaceful quiet of the early morning. This was the silence of a gathering storm. The doors of the truck flew open. A swarm of people spilled out, dressed in black uniforms, wearing headsets, carrying alien equipment, camera tripods, high-intensity lighting rigs, and silver reflectors that flashed blindingly in the sun. They moved fast, with military precision, ignoring the locals who had stopped to stare. "Hey, what's going on?" Henry muttered, standing up and moving to the window. Martha didn't answer. She stood rooted behind the counter, her hand gripping the cleaning cloth. A sense of unease crawled up her spine. She recognized this atmosphere. It was the air of staged chaos, of the frivolous theatrics she had spent 30 years running away from. From the lead SUV, a door swung open. A pair of polished, expensive leather shoes stepped onto the white snow, leaving a jarring black mark. The man who emerged was in his mid-30s, tall and slender, radiating a poorly concealed arrogance. He wore a pristine white chef's coat, tailored to hug his frame, the collar stiff and high. His blonde hair was coiffed to perfection, not a strand out of place despite the winter wind. It was Julian Thorne. Martha recognized him immediately. She didn't watch much TV, but this face was plastered on culinary magazines that lay scattered in the supermarket checkout lines. The bad boy of haute cuisine, the destroyer of tradition. These were the titles the media had bestowed upon him, and Julian seemed to relish the role. Julian stood in the middle of the street, removing his sunglasses. His ice-blue eyes swept dismissively over the weathered facade of the bakery. He smirked, a smile devoid of warmth, the grin of a hunter who had stumbled upon prey that was old and weak. He turned, signaling to a cameraman hoisting a massive rig on his shoulder. "Roll camera," a producer's voice shrieked. 3, 2, 1, action. Julian strode toward the shop, his footsteps seemingly crushing the piece of Maplewood. The crew orbited him like satellites, pointing lenses and boom mics at his every twitch. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The wind chime rang out ling-ling, but this time it sounded shrill, almost like a cry for help. The freezing air from outside rushed in, carrying snowflakes that swirled all the way to the counter, hitting Martha in the face. Her cozy space, smelling of butter and milk, was instantly invaded by the scent of overpowering cologne and calculation. Julian stood in the center of the room. The camera lights blazed to life, turning the dim, ambient interior into a blinding stage. He didn't look at Martha. He didn't acknowledge Henry or the bewildered customers. He looked straight into the camera lens, throwing his arms wide in a theatrical gesture. "Welcome back to Kitchens of America," Julian shouted, his voice booming, shattering the stillness. "Today we are at the edge of civilization. Look at this." He swept a finger around the room, his manicured hand pointing at the brick walls, the scarred wooden tables, and finally, the display case. "This is what the locals call a legend," Julian sneered, stepping closer to the glass. He tapped a fingernail against it. Click, click. "But I call it a museum of boredom. Apple pie? Butter cookies? Really? Are we in the 21st century or the Stone Age?" He turned to look at Martha for the first time. His gaze drilled into her, challenging, dismissive. In his eyes, she was just a rustic old woman, a minor obstacle on his path to higher ratings. He saw the wrinkles. He did not see the hands. He saw the apron. He did not see the discipline in her dark, deep eyes. "Madam Owner," Julian said, his tone dripping with patronizing grace. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't board this place up and turn it into a storage unit right now. Because looking at this flour-dusted nostalgia, I frankly feel insulted on behalf of the culinary arts." Martha stood still. She slowly took off her reading glasses and wiped them on her apron. She looked straight at Julian, her gaze unwavering, devoid of fear. Inside her, the pilot light of the oven was still burning, but another fire, the fire of professional pride that had slept for decades, suddenly roared to life. Before she could speak, Henry jumped up, his face red with anger. "Hey you, who do you think you are to come in here and—" "Sit down, Henry," Martha said, her voice soft but commanding, stopping the old man in his tracks. She stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward Julian. Her footsteps were light but grounded. She stood opposite him, a head shorter, yet projecting an aura that rivaled his towering ego. She looked into the black void of the camera lens, then back into Julian's bulging, arrogant eyes. The invasion had begun, and the war was not just about cakes. It was a war between noise and silence, between the facade and the authentic, between a TV star hungry for fame and a legend who had once stood at the summit of the world and now simply wanted peace. The silence that followed Martha's step forward was not the peaceful quiet of a snowy morning. It was the suffocating, static-charged silence of a fuse burning down toward dynamite. The red tally light on the primary camera blinked rhythmically, a unblinking, mechanical eye recording every twitch of facial muscle, every mote of dust suspended in the tense air. Julian Thorne did not step back. If anything, he leaned in, invading Martha's personal space with the practiced ease of a man who believed the world existed solely to be his stage. The smell of his cologne, a sharp, metallic blend of bergamot and something synthetic, clashed violently with the warm, yeasty aroma of the bakery, creating a sensory dissonance that made Martha's nose wrinkle slightly. "Cut!" the director yelled from behind the wall of equipment. "Great tension, really great. Julian, can we get that line again? The one about the Museum of Boredom? But this time, pick up a pastry. Interact with the props. Make it visceral." Julian's mask of disdain dropped for a split second, replaced by a professional, bored neutrality. "Sure. Reset. Give me a wipe." A makeup artist darted out from the shadows, dabbing at Julian's forehead with a powder puff, though there wasn't a bead of sweat to be seen. Martha stood frozen in place, watching this bizarre ritual. To them, her life's work, her sanctuary, was nothing more than a set, a textural background for a narrative they had already written before the trucks even parked. Action! Julian snapped back into character instantly. It was a terrifying transformation. His eyes narrowed, his posture sharpened, and the sneer returned, sharper than before. He reached into the display case, his hand hovering over a tray of Martha's signature apple turnovers. He selected one, lifting it with 2 fingers as if it were a contaminated specimen in a petri dish. "Look at this," Julian said to the camera, rotating the pastry. "The rustic charm. That's the polite term, isn't it? Rustic." He squeezed the turnover. The crust flaked, but not with the shattering explosion of 1,000 microlayers. It broke softly, yielding with a gentle sigh. "See that? No structure. No lamination. This is a short crust pretending to be puff pastry. It's lazy baking." He took a bite. The sound of his chewing was amplified by the lavalier microphone clipped to his pristine white collar. He chewed slowly, his face contorted in a performance of deep, analytical thought. Then he stopped. He looked at the half-eaten pastry, then at Martha, then back at the camera. "Sugar," he declared, tossing the remainder of the turnover onto the counter with a dull thud. "Just sugar. It's a sledgehammer of sweetness meant to mask the lack of technique. Where is the acidity to cut through the fat? Where is the textural contrast? Tastes like nostalgia. And nostalgia, my friends, is the enemy of progress." Henry Henderson, standing by the window, made a guttural noise in his throat. He crushed his paper cup in his hand, hot coffee spilling over his knuckles, but he didn't seem to feel the burn. "Now listen here, you pompous little." "Henry," Martha said again. Her voice was still low, but it had acquired a new quality, a resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. She didn't look at Henry. Her eyes were locked on Julian's hands. She was analyzing him. She ignored his words. Words were cheap. In her 30 years in Washington, she had heard politicians speak eloquently while destroying nations. She looked at his hands. They were manicured, yes, but underneath the lotion and the care, she saw the anatomy of a chef. The burn scar on the inside of his right forearm, an oven rack kiss. The slight callus on the side of his index finger. He wasn't a fake. He could cook. That made his insults worse. He wasn't speaking out of ignorance. He was speaking out of choice. He had chosen to forget. "You judge the book by the font size, Mr. Thorne," Martha said. She walked around the counter, closing the distance between them. The camera operator scrambled to adjust focus, tracking her movement. "You talk about lamination and acidity, but you missed the nutmeg." Julian blinked, caught off guard by her proximity. "Excuse me? The nutmeg," Martha repeated, her voice steady. "I grate it fresh every morning. It's in the filling. And the apples are not Granny Smith, which are one-dimensional. They are Northern Spies, grown 3 miles from here. They have a tartness that doesn't need lemon juice to mimic complexity. You didn't taste it because you were too busy listening to your own voice." The crew went deadly silent. The director made a keep rolling motion with his hand, his eyes wide. This was gold. The conflict was real. Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. He turned to the camera, inviting the audience to share in the joke. Did you hear that? The Northern Spy Defense. Madam, I have eaten in the finest patisseries in Paris, Tokyo, and Vienna. I have a palate insured for $2 million. If I say it's unbalanced, it is unbalanced. He began to pace the length of the small shop, his energy frantic and consuming. He picked up a biscotti and snapped it in half. Too hard. He poked a finger into a sponge cake. Too dense. This isn't baking. It's masonry. He stopped in front of the pride of the shop. The wedding cake display dummy in the corner, decorated with simple, elegant royal icing piping. And this, Julian gestured to the piping. Look at this scroll work. It's archaic. It belongs in a 1980s bridal magazine. You're stuck in time, Martha. You're baking for ghosts. You think because the locals, people who probably think Olive Garden is fine dining, applaud you that you're a chef? You're a feeder. There's a difference. He spun around, his coat whipping the air. I came here hoping to find a hidden gem. Instead, I found a tomb of culinary ambition. He leaned into the camera, whispering conspiratorially, "This is why American food is a joke to the rest of the world. Because of places like Martha's Hearth that refused to die." Something inside Martha clicked. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and chaotic. This was something colder. It was the icy clarity she used to feel when the Secret Service would sweep the kitchen before a diplomatic summit. It was the absolute focus required to spin sugar into a bird's nest while the world watched. She looked at Julian, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You are very loud, Mr. Thorne," she said. "I am passionate," Julian retorted. "Passion is loud. Excellence is loud." "No," Martha corrected him gently. "Insecurity is loud. Excellence is quiet." Julian's face flushed a deep crimson. The barb had hooked him. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Insecurity? You're talking to a man with 3 Michelin stars. I have revolutionized modern dessert architecture. I have deconstructed the very concept of sweetness. What have you done besides dusting flour on cookies for 50 years? "I have fed people," Martha said simply. "And I have learned that the louder the chef, the smaller the flavor." "Prove it," Julian hissed. The veneer of the TV host was slipping, revealing the bruised ego of the perfectionist underneath. "You want to lecture me on flavor? En technique? Fine. Let's stop talking. Let's cook. Or are you afraid your arthritis will flare up if you try anything more complex than a muffin?" The director was practically vibrating with excitement. "Yes. The challenge. Get the wide shot." Martha didn't blink. She looked at the modern equipment his crew had started to unpack: liquid nitrogen tanks, immersion circulators, dehydrators. Then she looked at her old cast-iron oven. "You want a challenge?" she stated, not asking. "I want to expose this fraud," Julian declared, sweeping his hand across the room. "I want to show these people what real pastry looks like. I want to make something right here, right now, side by side with you. And when I win, because I will win, I want you to admit on camera that this place is obsolete, that your time is over." "And if I win?" Martha asked. Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "If you win, if you can outbake Julian Thorne, I'll buy this building. I'll pave the street with gold. Hell, I'll apologize to every single one of your stale cookies." "No," Martha said. "I don't want your money, and the cookies don't care about your apology." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "If I win, you will clean my floor with a broom, and you will leave my town knowing that you are still a student." "Deal," Julian sneered. "So what's it going to be? A cupcake war? A cookie off? Let's pick something simple so you have a fighting chance." "No." Martha walked back behind the counter. She moved with a sudden fluidity that belied her age. She reached up to the high shelf and pulled down a specific ceramic dish. It was a white ramekin, simple, cylindrical, and unforgiving. She placed it on the counter between them. The sound of ceramic hitting wood was the only sound in the room. "Soufflé," Martha said. A gasp rippled through the production crew. Even the cameraman knew what that meant. Julian's eyes widened slightly. "A soufflé. A Grand Marnier Soufflé," Martha specified. "No uses. No gelatin cheats. Just egg whites, sugar, base, and heat. The purest test of a baker's hand." Julian stared at the ramekin. He knew the trap. A soufflé was a high-wire act. It required an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. It required knowing exactly when the protein structure of the egg white was strong enough to hold air but elastic enough to expand. And most importantly, it required a stable oven. He looked at Martha's oven. The massive black beast from the 1950s. It was gas. It likely had hot spots. It had no convection fan to circulate the air evenly. It was a dinosaur. A slow, predatory smile spread across Julian's face. She had just handed him the victory. He could make a soufflé in his sleep, but in that oven? It was a variable he could blame if things went wrong, but with his portable, laser-calibrated equipment, he could control his environment. She, however, was stuck with the beast. "You're digging your own grave, Grandma," Julian chuckled, shaking his head. "Soufflés are about precision. That oven of yours probably fluctuates 20 degrees every time the wind blows." "Then you should have no trouble beating me," Martha replied. "Fine. Grand Marnier Soufflé. 45 minutes. Clock starts when we crack the first egg." Julian began unbuttoning his cuffs, rolling up his sleeves. "Get the kit," he shouted to his assistants. "I want the copper bowls. I want the infrared thermometer. I want the induction burner." The kitchen instantly transformed into a chaotic staging ground. The crew pushed Martha's sturdy wooden tables apart, creating two distinct workstations. On the left, Julian's side was rapidly filled with gleaming stainless steel, digital scales, and a portable convection oven that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. It was a sterile laboratory of gastronomy. On the right, Martha's station remained unchanged. A wooden board, a whisk, a ceramic bowl, a zester. Henry Henderson stood up, his face pale. He walked over to the counter, leaning in close to Martha. "Martha," he whispered urgently, "are you out of your mind? That man is a shark. And your oven. The door latch has been sticky since last winter. If it jars, the soufflé will fall." Martha looked at Henry. Her eyes were soft, filled with affection for the man who had worried about her for decades. "Henry," she said quietly, "do you remember the cake I made for the governor's inauguration in '88? Well, yes, but... And do you remember the thunderstorm that knocked out the power for 6 hours that day?" Henry paused, the memory surfacing. "Yes. You finished the decorations by candlelight." "I didn't just decorate, Henry. I baked the final layers in the residual heat of the oven because I knew exactly how long the cast iron would hold the temperature." She patted his hand. "Go sit down, and maybe move your chair a bit to the left. You'll have a better view of his face when he loses." Henry stared at her for a moment, then a slow grin spread across his face. He nodded and retreated to his corner. "Are we ready?" the director shouted. The energy in the room was electric. This was the kind of drama reality TV producers sold their souls for. Julian stood at his station, holding a whisk like a weapon. He looked energized, in his element. He turned to Martha. "Last chance to back out. You can just admit I'm right, and we can all go home." Martha didn't answer. She reached under the counter. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She untied the strings of her faded floral apron, the uniform of the kindly grandmother, the disguise she had worn so comfortably for so long. She folded it and placed it on the stool. Then, from a drawer lined with cedar paper, she pulled out a different apron. It was white, stark, blinding white. The fabric was heavy, high-quality Egyptian cotton, starched to perfection. It wrapped around her waist with a satisfying snap. As she tied the knot in the front, a sharp, efficient French knot, her posture seemed to change. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The softness in her face evaporated, replaced by the granite-hard expression of a commander surveying a battlefield. She wasn't Martha the cookie lady anymore. She was someone else. Someone formidable. Julian noticed the change. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. There was something in the way she tied that knot. A muscle memory that spoke of professional kitchens, of brigades, of orders barked over the roar of exhaust fans. "I am ready," Martha said. Her voice was no longer raspy. It was clear as a bell. "Timekeeper," Julian yelled, trying to regain the dominance. "On your mark." The assistant producer held up a stopwatch. Martha picked up an egg. She didn't look at the clock. She looked at the egg, feeling its weight, its temperature. "Get set." Julian grabbed his digital thermometer gun, aiming it at his bowl. "Go!" The room exploded into motion. Julian moved like a blur. He cracked eggs one-handed, separating yolks and whites with a flashy tossing motion between the shell halves. "Egg whites to room temperature." He narrated for the camera as he worked. "We need maximum protein unfolding. Sugar syrup to 118 degrees Celsius for the Italian meringue base. It provides stability." His station was a symphony of noise. The clang of metal on metal, the beep of thermometers, the whir of the induction burner. He was fast, efficient, and flashy. He was throwing sugar into the pot from high above, creating a cascade of crystals. "You see this?" Julian boasted, whisking furiously. "This is control. I control the molecules. I tell them what to do." On the other side, there was silence. Martha moved with a terrifying slowness. She cracked her eggs against the flat surface of the counter, never the rim of the bowl to avoid shell fragments. She separated them using her fingers, letting the whites slip through her hands like liquid silk. She didn't use a thermometer for her milk. She didn't check the humidity gauge. She poured the Grand Marnier into a small saucepan. Julian was using a dehydrated orange powder to intensify the flavor. Martha was using the real liquor, but she was doing something strange. She was tilting the pan, letting the flame catch the alcohol vapors. Whoosh! A controlled burst of blue fire rose up, caramelizing the sugars in the alcohol, burning off the harsh ethanol bite, but leaving the deep, woody essence of the cognac aged in oak barrels. Julian glanced over, sneering. "Flambe? Dramatic. But you're boiling off the aromatics." "I am concentrating the soul," Martha murmured, more to the sauce than to him. She began to whisk the whites. She didn't use an electric mixer. She used a large balloon whisk. The sound was rhythmic. Shoo-shhhh-shhh. It was the sound of breath. Her arm moved in a perfect oval, incorporating air not by force, but by persuasion. She wasn't beating the eggs into submission. She was inviting them to rise. Julian was already folding his mixture. "Look at that gloss," he shouted, tilting his bowl to the camera. "That is a perfect stiff peak. Now into the ramekins, buttered and sugared with vertical strokes to guide the rise. Physics, people. Physics." He slid his tray into his portable convection oven and punched the digital keypad. 375 degrees. Fan on low. Timer. 14 minutes. Exact. He wiped his hands on a towel and leaned back, looking smug. He was done with the prep in record time. "Beat that." Martha was still folding. She used a spatula, cutting through the center of the mixture and folding it over the top. Once, twice, gentle. She treated the foam as if it were a sleeping infant. If she overworked it, the air bubbles would pop. If she underworked it, the heavy base would sink. She could feel the mixture tightening. It was ready. She poured the batter into the ramekins. She took her thumb and ran it around the inside rim of the dish. A classic technique to create a top hat effect, allowing the soufflé to rise straight up without snagging on the edge. Then she walked to the black beast. She didn't look at the temperature dial. The dial had been broken since 1996. She opened the heavy door. She placed her hand inside for 2 seconds. Too hot. She left the door open for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She felt the heat again. Perfect. She slid the tray onto the middle rack. She closed the door. She didn't slam it. She closed it until the latch clicked. A sound she felt in her bones rather than heard. "No timer?" Julian mocked, checking his watch. Bold strategy. Or is it senility? Martha turned to him. She wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek. The timer is in the smell, Mr. Thorne, she said calmly. When the scent of the toasted sugar hits the nose before the scent of the egg, it is done. We'll see. Julian crossed his arms. Now comes the waiting game, the hardest part for an amateur. The bakery fell silent again. The cameras kept rolling. The two chefs stood on opposite sides of the room. One watched a digital countdown ticking away seconds in bright red LED numbers. The other watched the snow falling outside the window, listening to the heartbeat of the fire inside the iron box. The war had moved from words to heat, and in the belly of the ovens, the chemistry of victory and defeat was already bubbling. The air in the bakery had changed. It was no longer just oxygen and nitrogen. It was a medium of suspense, thick enough to wade through. The silence that settled over Martha's hearth was absolute, broken only by two distinct sounds. The aggressive, high-pitched whir of the cooling fan on Julian Thorne's state-of-the-art portable convection oven, and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock shaped like a cat, its tail swinging back and forth with the indifference of time itself. For the production crew, this was the dead air they usually cut out in post-production. But for the two combatants standing on opposite sides of the room, this was the battle. The baking phase was the trench warfare of the pastry world, a period of agonizing helplessness where action ceased and faith began. Julian Thorne paced. He could not stand still. His pristine white chef's clogs squeaked against the worn wooden floorboards, a sound that grated on the nerves of everyone present. He stopped in front of his workstation, his eyes glued to the digital display of his oven. The red LED numbers read 375 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing with a steady, reassuring brightness. Beside the oven, a laptop was tethered via a USB-C cable, displaying a real-time graph of the internal cavity temperature, accurate to within a tenth of a degree. It was a marvel of German engineering. It was a fortress of control. And yet, Julian was sweating. He tapped the screen of the humidity monitor he had set up next to the dough roller. The number was climbing. "Damn it," he whispered, the microphone at his collar picking up the hiss of air. "The humidity is spiking. Why is it spiking?" He glared at the front door. The seal was old. Every time the wind gusted outside, carrying the heavy Vermont snow against the wood, invisible tendrils of moisture were seeping in, altering the atmospheric pressure of the room. A soufflé was a structure of air bubbles held together by protein coagulation. Atmospheric pressure mattered. If the air was too heavy, the rise would be inhibited. If it was too dry, the crust would set before the center could expand, causing a volcanic eruption. Julian grabbed a tablet and frantically adjusted the fan speed of his oven, reducing the convection flow by 5% to compensate for the perceived moisture. "I need a dehumidifier in here," he barked at a production assistant who was cowering behind a light stand. "Who scouts a location without checking the HVAC capabilities? This is amateur hour." The assistant scrambled away, pretending to look for equipment that didn't exist. Julian turned back to his oven, his fingers drumming a frantic tattoo on the stainless steel countertop. He was fighting the room. He was fighting the weather. He was fighting the chaotic, untamable nature of the world outside his controlled environment. Inside his head, a cacophony of voices screamed at him. Sponsors threatening to pull funding, Twitter trolls dissecting his failure. The crushing weight of maintaining a reputation built on the idea that he was infallible. Across the room, Martha stood like a statue carved from salt and patience. She had finished cleaning her station. The whisk was washed and hung. The bowl was dried. The eggshells were composted. Now she simply stood, her hands clasped loosely in front of her white apron, staring at the black iron door of her oven. She didn't pace. She didn't check a watch. She didn't look at the humidity. To the casual observer, she looked serene, perhaps even detached. But inside Martha's mind, she was traveling. The heat radiating from the cast iron against her legs was a portal, transporting her back through time, away from the snowy morning in Maplewood to a humid, stifling night in July 1987. The memory washed over her with the clarity of a film reel. She was back in the East Wing of the White House. The air conditioning had failed 3 hours ago. The kitchen was a sweltering box of stainless steel and temperamental egos. Upstairs, in the state dining room, President Reagan was hosting a delicate summit with the French Prime Minister. The menu was critical. The dessert was to be a Grand Marnier Soufflé, a nod to the French guests, a gesture of culinary diplomacy. Martha, then Evelyn Vance, stood before a row of 6 industrial gas ovens. The executive chef, a man named Henri who possessed a temper shorter than a burning fuse, was in a panic. The thermostats on the new ovens were malfunctioning due to the heat wave. They were reading 400 degrees, but the air felt hotter. Or maybe cooler. No one knew. "We cannot serve them," Henri had screamed, throwing a towel on the floor. "We switch to the ice cream. Pull the soufflés. They will burn or they will fall. We cannot risk the embarrassment." Evelyn had blocked his path. She remembered the feeling of the sweat trickling down her back, the sheer terror of defying her boss, and the even greater terror of serving a failed dish to a head of state. "No, chef," she had said, her voice shaking but her hands steady. "We don't pull them. We don't open the doors. The gauges are broken." "Evelyn, I don't need the gauges," she had replied. She had closed her eyes, just as she was doing now in Maplewood. She had placed her hand against the hot metal door. She listened to the hiss of the gas. She inhaled the air coming from the vents. She knew the physics of the soufflé not as an equation, but as a living cycle. She knew that at minute 12, the water in the egg whites would turn to steam, pushing the protein network upward. She knew that at minute 18, the sugar would begin to caramelize on the edges, creating a structural shell. She knew that if she opened the door 1 second too early, the thermal shock would cause the steam to condense instantly, and the soufflé would collapse like a dying star. She had stood guard over those ovens for 22 minutes, defying the screaming chef, defying the broken thermometers. She waited for the smell, the specific, elusive scent of toasted sugar meeting the rich, boozy aroma of the orange liqueur. Not the smell of burning, but the smell of becoming. When she finally opened the doors that night in 1987, 24 golden towers stood tall and proud. The French Prime Minister had reportedly asked for seconds. Henri had never yelled at her again. A sudden beep cut through the memory. Martha blinked, the White House kitchen dissolving back into the Rustic bakery. The sound came from Julian's station. "Warning!" A robotic voice chirped from his laptop. "Internal temperature fluctuation detected. Compensation mode active." Julian let out a string of curses. "The voltage," he hissed, looking at the power strip. "The wiring in this building is ancient. It's not delivering a consistent 120 volts. The heating element is pulsing." He grabbed the handle of his oven door, his knuckles white. He looked like he wanted to rip the machine apart. "Stabilize, you piece of junk. Stabilize." He was trying to pilot a spaceship with a joystick that kept disconnecting. He looked at Martha, expecting to see her panicking too. Her oven was gas, fed by a line that probably hadn't been inspected since the Cold War. Surely, if his precision instrument was struggling, her dinosaur must be failing. But Martha was just breathing. She could feel the rhythm of her oven. The cast iron was a heat sink. It absorbed the energy and radiated it back slowly, evenly. It didn't care about voltage spikes. It didn't care about the wind outside. It held the heat like a secret. It was a massive, heavy, consistent womb for the delicate batter. 10 minutes remaining. The producer called out, checking his stopwatch against Julian's display. Julian wiped sweat from his brow. He grabbed a probe thermometer, debating whether to pierce the seal and check the center. No, that would kill the rise. He had to trust the sensors. But the sensors were fighting him. The graph on his laptop looked like a seismograph of an earthquake. 1 minute it was 375, the next 368, then 382. "It's the draft," Julian muttered, his eyes darting around the room. "There's a draft coming from that window. Someone block it." 2 production assistants grabbed a reflector board and held it up against the window like a shield. "Pathetic," Henry Henderson grumbled from his corner. He was sipping his second coffee, watching the spectacle with the amusement of a man watching a city slicker try to chop wood. Boy thinks he can block out the winter with a piece of cardboard. 5 minutes. Now, the sensory experience began to shift. At first, the smell in the room had been dominated by the lingering sense of the morning bake, bread and cinnamon. But now a new player entered the stage. It started faint, a whisper of vanilla. Then it grew. The rich, fatty scent of butter melting and browning. The sharp, alcoholic tang of the Grand Marnier vaporizing, leaving behind the deep, citrusy essence of the cognac. Julian sniffed the air aggressively. "I smell scorching," he announced, looking at Martha. "Your bottom heat is too high. Cast iron conducts too fast at the base. You're burning the bottom crust." Martha didn't react. She knew what he was smelling. It wasn't burning. It was the Maillard reaction, the chemical marriage of amino acids and reducing sugars that created the brown color and the complex flavor. It was the smell of victory. She took a step closer to her oven. She leaned down, putting her ear near the vent. She could hear it. Faint sizzle. The sound of the soufflé pulling away from the buttered sides of the ramekin. The sound of the rise. 3 minutes. Julian was vibrating. He was tapping his foot so hard the floor shook. "Come on, come on, come on," he chanted. His graph was stabilizing, but was it too late? Had the temperature drops stunted the climb? He looked at the window of his oven. The glass was tinted and double-paned for insulation, making it hard to see inside without the internal light, which he had turned off to save power for the heating element. He squinted. He could see a shape. It looked high. It looked good. Hope flared in his chest. Maybe his technology had saved him. Maybe the compensation algorithms had worked. If he pulled this off, it would be his greatest triumph. To conquer the elements. To bake perfection in a hovel. 1 minute. Martha straightened up. She adjusted her apron. She looked at the camera lens that was zoomed in on her face. Her expression was unreadable, ancient, and profound. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You might want to get your oven mitts." "I know the time, old woman," Julian snapped. 30 seconds. "No." Martha shook her head slightly. "Not the time. The smell." "What?" "The sugar is telling you. It's done. The timer says 20 seconds. Julian pointed at the red numbers. "Science says 20 seconds. "Then listen to your science," Martha said, turning back to her oven. "I will listen to my cake." 10, 9, 8. The producer counted down, his voice rising in crescendo. Martha reached for a pair of thick, worn cotton pads. They were stained with the ghosts of 1,000 meals. Julian grabbed his silicone, heat-resistant, Kevlar-reinforced tactical gloves. 3, 2, 1. Time. Ovens open. The command cracked like a whip. Simultaneously, 2 doors opened. On the left, Julian yanked the handle of his convection oven. A blast of fan-forced air rushed out. He reached in and pulled out the tray, spinning around to present it to the camera with a flourish. "Behold!" he shouted. "Perfection." The camera zoomed in. For a heartbeat, it looked impressive. The soufflé had risen. It was high, puffed up like a chef's hat. But then, physics took its toll. The center of Julian's soufflé was pale, too pale. The compensation mode of his oven had spiked the heat to maintain the average, but the fluctuations had caused the outer shell to cook faster than the interior. The structure was there, but it was fragile, brittle. As the cold air of the bakery hit the soufflé, a tragic sound was audible to everyone in the room. A soft pft. A crack appeared right down the center of the golden dome. It was a fissure of failure. Then, in slow motion, the center imploded. The majestic tower didn't just sink. It collapsed into itself, folding inward like a punctured lung. Within 5 seconds, what had been a tall, proud soufflé was now a sad, concave bowl of mush with a jagged, broken rim. Julian stared at it. His mouth hung open. The tray shook in his hands. "No." He whispered. "No, no, no. The humidity, the draft. It's not my fault. It's this cursed building." He looked up, eyes wild, searching for an excuse, searching for someone to blame. And then his eyes landed on Martha. Martha had opened her oven door gently, with the reverence of a priest opening a tabernacle. She didn't pull the tray out immediately. She let the door sit ajar for a second, allowing the pressure to equalize, acclimating the baby to the new world. Then, she slid the rack out. There was no sound from the crew this time. No gasp, just a collective holding of breath. Sitting in the white porcelain ramekin was a miracle. It was colossal. It had risen a full 2 inches above the rim, perfectly vertical, with no leaning, no wavering. The sides were straight and smooth, bearing the marks of the brush strokes where the butter had been applied. The top was a flat, golden plateau, brown to the color of autumn leaves, dusted with a fine snow of powdered sugar that hadn't melted because the surface temperature was exactly right. It didn't wobble. It didn't crack. It shimmied. As Martha placed it gently on the wooden counter, the soufflé jiggled. A sexy, rhythmic dance that showed the interior was cooked to a perfect, creamy cloud, neither liquid nor solid, but existing in that magical state in between. It was breathing. Julian dropped his tray. The sound of metal hitting wood was deafening. His collapsed disaster slid off and splattered onto the floor, a mess of raw egg and broken dreams. But he didn't look at it. He couldn't take his eyes off Martha's creation. He walked over to it, drawn like a moth to a flame. The arrogance, the persona, the TV star facade. It all melted away, leaving only the chef. And the chef in him was weeping. How? Julian breathed, his voice stripped of all pretense. The heat, it fluctuates. The gas, it's uneven. How did you get that lift? How did you get that structure? Martha took off her oven mitts. She looked at the young man, not with triumph, but with pity. You fought the heat, Julian, she said softly. You tried to conquer it with numbers and sensors. You treated the fire like an employee you could bully. She touched the side of the ramekin lightly. I didn't fight it. I worked with it. The oven has hot spots, yes. I know them. I rotated the dish 3 degrees every 2 minutes in my mind. The draft comes from the door, yes. I stood in front of the oven to shield it with my body. You used technology to distance yourself from the process. I used myself to connect to it. Julian looked down at his hands, the expensive gloves still on. He looked at his high-tech oven, which was now flashing an error code. System overload. Julian stammered. He looked at the perfection on the counter. It's beautiful. It's just eggs and air, Julian, Martha said. But it's honest. The director, who had been stunned into silence, suddenly remembered he was making a TV show. Cut. That was, my God. That was incredible. We need a beauty shot of Martha's soufflé. Close up. Get the steam coming off it. The crew swarmed the counter, lenses inches away from the masterpiece. But Julian didn't move. He stood in the shadow of the cameras, looking at the mess on the floor, his mess. He felt naked. For the first time in years, he wasn't the judge. He was the one being judged. And the verdict was absolute. We aren't done. Martha's voice cut through the commotion. The crew froze. Julian looked up. It looks good, Martha said, picking up 2 silver spoons from her drawer. But a soufflé is not a sculpture. It is food. And the truth of food is not in the eyes. She walked over to Julian and held out a spoon. The metal gleamed in the harsh TV lights. Eat, she commanded, and tell me what you taste. Julian hesitated. His hand trembled as he took the spoon. This was the final execution. He knew that the moment he put that spoon into the soufflé, the texture would reveal everything. If it was grainy, he could salvage some dignity. If it was too eggy, he could criticize the balance. He approached the golden tower. He broke the surface. Crackle. The sound of the crust breaking was crisp, like stepping on dry leaves. He scooped up a spoonful of the steaming, cloud-like interior. He put it in his mouth. He closed his eyes. And then the ghost really appeared. It wasn't a visual ghost. It was a ghost of flavor. The taste hit his palate and bypassed his analytical brain, going straight to the hippocampus, the seat of memory. The texture was impossible. It dissolved instantly, leaving behind a rich, velvety coating of cream. The sweetness was restrained, allowing the sharp, bright notes of the Grand Marnier to sing. But underneath it all, there was a depth, a savory richness that anchored the airy foam. Julian stopped breathing. His eyes snapped open, wide with shock. He stared at Martha, but he didn't see the old woman in the apron anymore. He saw a banquet hall. He saw crystal chandeliers. He saw himself, 22 years old, a junior sous chef fresh out of culinary school, attending a gala at the White House as a guest of his mentor. He remembered tasting a dessert that had made him cry because he realized he knew nothing about cooking. "This taste," Julian whispered, the spoon clattering to the floor. "The crème pâtissière base. You folded it while it was still warm. That's why it's so creamy. That's the Vance technique." He looked at Martha, searching her face frantically. "Nobody does that anymore. It's too risky. Curdles if you miss the window by a second. Only one person mastered that. Only one." He looked at the photo on the wall, the one he had dismissed earlier as a prop. He looked at the signature on the bottom. Evelyn. The blood drained from Julian's face. He staggered back, bracing himself against his high-tech workstation. "You," he choked out. "You aren't just a baker." Martha smiled, a genuine, warm smile this time. "I told you, Julian, names don't matter. Only the taste matters." The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was reverent. The king had fallen, and in his place, the queen had returned to her throne. The sound of the silver spoon hitting the wooden floorboards was not loud, yet in the suspended silence of Martha's hearth, it rang out with the finality of a gavel striking a judge's bench. The spoon bounced once, twice, spinning on its handle before coming to rest near the toe of Julian Thorne's Italian leather shoe. But Julian did not move to pick it up. He did not move at all. He stood frozen, his body rigid, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a point in space that existed somewhere between the present moment and a memory buried 2 decades deep. Inside his mouth, the bite of soufflé was dissolving, but the sensation it triggered was expanding, exploding, rewriting the neural pathways of his brain. For a man like Julian, whose palate was insured for millions and whose career was built on the ruthless deconstruction of flavor, tasting food was usually an intellectual exercise. He analyzed texture, acidity, salinity, and mouthfeel like a forensic scientist dissecting a crime scene. But this was not analysis. This was an ambush. The texture was the first thing to shatter his defenses. It was impossible. A soufflé, by its nature, is a compromise, a battle between the heaviness of the base and the lightness of the egg whites. But this bite had no weight. It hit the tongue and vanished, leaving behind a ghost of creaminess that coated the roof of the mouth with the texture of velvet. It was warm, comforting, and terrifyingly perfect. Then came the flavor. It wasn't just Grand Marnier. Anyone could pour liqueur into a batter. This was the essence of the orange grove, the deep, woody, caramelized notes of the cognac barrel, and underneath it all, a subtle, savory whisper of salt that elevated the sugar into something profound. It was a flavor that didn't scream. It sang. And it sang a song Julian hadn't heard since he was 22 years old. The bakery around him, the cameras, the crew, the snow falling outside, faded into a blur. Julian was suddenly standing in a different kitchen. It was vast, gleaming with stainless steel, and buzzing with the terrifying, hushed energy of a state dinner service. He was a young, terrified commis chef, sweating through his whites, hiding in the corner of the White House kitchen, watching a woman command the room. She didn't shout. She didn't throw pans. She simply moved, and the kitchen moved with her. He remembered sneaking a leftover ramekin from the prep station, scraping the remnants of a soufflé that had been deemed imperfect for the president, but was the most perfect thing he had ever tasted. He remembered the name whispered by the staff with a mixture of fear and reverence. The Queen of Sugar. "Vance," Julian whispered. The word escaped his lips like a prayer, or perhaps a confession. The cameraman, sensing the shift in the room, zoomed in tighter on Julian's face. He captured the moment the mask fell. The the sneer, the arrogance, the practiced TV persona. It all dissolved, leaving behind the naked, vulnerable face of a man who had just realized he was standing on holy ground. Julian's knees buckled. He reached out, grabbing the edge of the sturdy oak counter to steady himself. He looked up at Martha. The old woman in the simple apron wasn't looking at the cameras. She was looking at him, her dark eyes calm, patient, waiting for him to catch up. "The warmth?" Julian stammered, his voice trembling so much the lavalier microphone picked up the vibration in his chest. You folded the whites into the base while the crème pâtissière was still hot. That's impossible. Cooks the eggs. Turns them to scrambled eggs. Unless you temper the whites with a sacrifice. Martha finished for him, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. You sacrifice 20% of the foam to cool the base. Then you fold the rest. Creates a suspension. A cloud. Julian nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. The Vance technique is not in books. It was never published. It was oral history, a myth. He turned his head slowly, like a rusted machine, toward the dusty picture frame sitting ignored behind the register. He had glanced at it earlier, dismissed it as a prop, a piece of kitschy Americana. Now he saw it for what it was, the evidence. He stumbled toward it, pushing past a stunned production assistant. He grabbed the frame, his fingers wiping away the layer of flour and dust that obscured the bottom corner. He brought it up to his face, squinting through the glare of the studio lights. There she was, younger, dark hair pulled back in the same severe bun, standing next to Reagan. The embroidery on her chef's coat was clear now. Evelyn Vance, executive pastry chef, the White House. Julian let out a strangled sob. He turned back to the room, holding the photo up like a holy relic. "Do you know who this is?" He shouted at his crew, his voice cracking. "Do you idiots know who we are filming?" The crew looked around, confused. The director, Gary, stepped out from behind the monitors, sensing that the script had gone out the window but the story had just become infinitely better. "Julian, talk to us. Who is she?" "This isn't Martha," Julian said, gesturing wildly at the old woman who was now calmly wiping down her counter. "This is Evelyn Vance. She vanished in 1990. She is the only American pastry chef to ever win the Coupe du Monde de la Pâtisserie twice. She invented the sugar glass dome. She fed 3 presidents." A gasp rippled through the room. The locals, Henry, Mary, Joe, looked at each other. They knew Martha was a good baker. They knew she had a past. But they had no idea she was a titan. To them, she was just the woman who gave them free cookies when they were sad. Henry Henderson stood up from his chair, his chest puffing out with pride. "I tried to tell you, Sonny," he grumbled, though there was no malice in his voice anymore, only a smug satisfaction. "You came here looking for a fight, and you picked one with a tank." Julian lowered the photo, his hands shaking. He looked at his own station, the high-tech oven, the digital thermometers, the liquid nitrogen tank. It all looked so silly now, so childish. He had brought toys to a war. He had tried to use algorithms to defeat a woman who had baking in her DNA. He looked down at the floor, at the splattered remains of his own soufflé. It lay there, a wet, sad, orange mess, a physical manifestation of his ego. He walked back to the center of the room. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at Martha. He took a deep breath, and for the first time since he walked into the shop, he unbuttoned his chef's coat. He undid the top button, then the next, loosening the stiff, high collar that had choked him. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing the burned scars on his arms, the only honest things about him. "I lost," Julian said. The words hung in the air. "Yes," Martha said simply. "You did. I was arrogant," Julian continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "I came here to mock you. I called your food. I called it a museum. I called it trash." He swallowed hard. "I apologize, not because I lost the bet, but because I forgot." "Forgot what?" Martha asked. She wasn't letting him off the hook yet. An apology was easy. Understanding was hard. I forgot that food isn't about the chef, Julian whispered. It's about the eater. I made my soufflé to show off my oven. You made yours. To feed me. Martha nodded. A small, almost imperceptible softening occurred in her eyes. You have good hands, Julian. I watched you prep. You have rhythm. You have skill. But you are noisy. Your mind is noisy. You are so busy trying to prove you exist that you forget to let the ingredients speak. She walked around the counter and picked up the broom leaning against the wall. It was an old broom, the straw bristles worn down at an angle from years of use. She held it out to him. The bet, she said. The room held its breath. This was the moment. Julian Thorne, the millionaire chef, the TV star, the man who had fired assistants for bringing him the wrong brand of sparkling water. Would he do it? Or would he storm out, call his lawyers, and bury the footage? Julian looked at the broom. Then he looked at the floor. He took the broom. The dustpan is under the sink, Martha added helpfully. Julian nodded. He walked to the sink, found the metal dustpan, and knelt down. He didn't do it quickly. He didn't do it ironically. He got down on his hands and knees, ruining the knees of his $1,000 trousers in the melting snow and flour. He began to sweep. The only sound in the room was the swish-swish of the straw against the wood. The cameramen were filming, but they had lowered their cameras to hip level, shooting instinctively. Felt less like a reality show and more like a documentary about penance. Julian swept up the remains of his failed soufflé. He swept up the eggshells he had carelessly tossed aside during his frantic prep. He swept up the flour dust. He worked his way into the corners under the tables. Sweat dripped from his nose, mixing with the dust. As he swept, memories continued to flood him. He remembered why he started cooking. Not for the fame, not for the cameras, but because of his grandmother's kitchen in Ohio. The smell of yeast, the feeling of safety. Somewhere along the way between the culinary school in Paris and the contract negotiations in LA, he had lost that. He had traded safety for adoration and warmth for precision. He finished the main floor and moved toward the counter where Martha stood. He swept the area around her feet. He didn't look up. He focused on the grain of the wood, on the rhythm of the work. It was meditative. For the first time all day, his heart rate slowed down. When the floor was spotless, Julian stood up. He walked to the trash bin and emptied the dustpan. He put the broom back exactly where Martha had taken it from. He turned to face her. He looked exhausted, disheveled, and completely defeated. And yet, he looked more like a chef than he had when he walked in. "The floor is clean, Chef Vance," he said, using her title with a solemnity that made the director shiver. "It is," Martha agreed, inspecting the floor. "You missed a spot near the radiator, but it will do." She reached under the counter and pulled out a fresh cloth. She dampened it in the sink and handed it to him. "Now wipe your face. You have flour on your nose. You look like a clown." A ripple of laughter went through the room. Nervous, relieved laughter. Even Julian cracked a smile, though it was a watery one. He took the cloth and wiped his face. "So," Julian said, handing the cloth back, "what happens now? You won. I assume you want me to pack up my circus and leave your town alone." "That was the deal," Martha said. "You leave. You don't air the episode. You let us go back to being a museum of boredom." Julian winced at his own words. I can kill the episode. I own the production company. It will never see the light of day." "Good, but..." Julian hesitated. He looked at his high-tech equipment, then at Martha's oven. He looked at the door, leading out to his comfortable, chauffeured life. He didn't want to go. The thought of getting back into that black SUV and driving away, back to the noise, back to the fake smiles and the empty food, terrified him. "But what?" Martha asked, crossing her arms. I can't replicate that texture," Julian blurted out. "The soufflé. I know the theory. I know the advanced technique in principle. But I don't know the feel. I don't know how you knew the oven was ready without a thermometer. I don't know how you knew the eggs were done by the smell." He took a step forward, his hands open in a pleading gesture. I have 3 stars. I have awards. But I don't know what you know. And today proved that I don't know anything that matters. Martha studied him. She saw the desperation in him. It wasn't the desperation of a man wanting to save face. It was the hunger of a student. She had seen that look before in the eyes of young apprentices in the White House kitchen, the ones who were willing to burn their hands to get the sugar work right. You want to learn? Martha asked skeptically. Yes, Julian said immediately. Teach me, please. I'm retired, Julian. I run a bakery in Vermont. I don't run a culinary institute. I don't care, Julian said. He turned to the director. Gary, pack it up. The shoot is over. Go back to New York. What? Gary dropped his clipboard. Julian, we have a schedule. We have sponsors. You can't just... I said pack it up. Julian roared, a flash of his old fire returning, but directed at the right target this time. Take the van. Take the cameras. Take the liquid nitrogen. Get out. He turned back to Martha. I'll stay. I'll sweep the floors. I'll peel apples. I'll do the dishes. I don't care. Just let me watch you bake tomorrow morning. The room fell silent again. This was unprecedented. The biggest chef in America was begging to be a dishwasher in a village bakery. Martha looked at him for a long time. She looked at his expensive shoes, which were now ruined. She looked at his soft hands. You wake up at 3 a.m., Martha said sternly. I can do that, Julian nodded vigorously. You don't talk before coffee, she added. Understood. And you leave that white coat in the trash. Here we wear aprons. And we don't wear our names on our chests. We earn our names by what we put on the plate. Julian ripped the Velcro name tag off his jacket and tossed it onto the counter. Done. Martha sighed. A long, weary sigh that hid a hint of amusement. She looked over at Henry, who was grinning from ear to ear. Henry, she said, it looks like we have an intern. Looks like it, Henry chuckled. Though I doubt he knows how to shovel snow. We might need to teach him that first. Everybody out. Martha clapped her hands, addressing the camera crew. Show's over, and take that black truck with you, it's blocking my sunlight. I have dough to proof. The crew, bewildered but obedient, began to scramble. They broke down the lights, coiled the cables, and packed away the monitors. The energy in the room shifted from high-stakes drama to the mundane chaos of packing up. Julian stood in the middle of it all, but he didn't help them. He stood by the counter watching Martha. She had already moved on. She was measuring flour for the next day's brioche. She was back in her rhythm, ignoring the noise. But as the last camera case was wheeled out the door, and the heavy oak door clicked shut, cutting off the cold wind, the bakery became quiet again. The true silence returned. Julian stood there, feeling awkward, stripped of his entourage. Well, Martha didn't look up. Don't just stand there like a garnish. Grab a towel. The sink is full of bowls. Julian Thorne, the man who had cooked for royalty and movie stars, smiled. It was a real smile, small and nervous. He walked to the sink, rolled up his sleeves further, and plunged his hands into the hot, soapy water. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the tire tracks of the TV trucks, turning the world white and clean again. Inside, the smell of baking bread began to rise, mixing with the scent of soap and the feeling of a new beginning. The lesson had just begun. 3 o'clock in the morning was not a time. It was a punishment. For the first week, Julian Thorne woke up believing he was in hell. The alarm on his phone, which he had set to a jarring industrial buzzer, would slice through the freezing air of the guest room above the bakery, dragging him from dreams of sous vide baths and truffle shavings into the dark, wooden reality of Maplewood. His back ached. The mattress Martha had provided was filled with horsehair and stubbornness, offering none of the memory foam embrace he was used to in his Manhattan penthouse. His hands, once ensured and moisturized daily with La Mer, were now raw, the cuticles frayed, the skin dry and cracking from the endless cycle of hot water, soap, and flour. He rolled out of bed, his feet hitting the floorboards that seemed to retain the permafrost of the Vermont winter. There was no hot shower to wake him up, The water heater took 20 minutes to groan into action, and Martha expected him downstairs in 5. So, he splashed freezing water on his face from the porcelain basin, shivering violently, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The face staring back was different. The golden tan from his last vacation in St. Tropez had faded to a winter pallor. The meticulously styled hair was flattened and unruly, but the eyes, usually darting around, looking for a camera or an exit, were bloodshot and focused. He pulled on the white apron. It was stiff, smelling of starch and yesterday's yeast. He hated the apron. It didn't have his name on it. It didn't have the Kitchens of America logo. It was an eraser wiping away his identity every time he tied the string. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive. Martha was there, as she always was, a ghost in the machine. She moved through the pre-dawn gloom without turning on the main lights, navigating by the orange glow of the pilot lights and the gray luminescence of the snow outside the windows. She was measuring flour for the sourdough starter. She didn't use a scale. She used a chipped enamel mug, scooping, leveling with a finger and dumping. "You're late," she said without turning around. "It's 3:02, chef," Julian croaked, his voice thick with sleep. "The yeast doesn't care about your 2 minutes," Martha replied, the rhythm of her scooping never breaking. "But the yeast wakes up when the temperature changes. You entered the room, you changed the airflow. Now we are behind." Julian suppressed the urge to scream that thermodynamics didn't work that fast. He walked to his station, the intern station, which was actually just the oldest, wobbly table near the drafty back door. "What is the lesson today?" Julian asked, trying to inject some professional enthusiasm into his voice. "Lamination? Puff pastry? Are we finally doing the croissants?" Martha stopped. She turned slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him with that maddeningly calm expression, like a mountain looking at a pebble. "Bread," she said. Julian sighed, letting his shoulders slump. "Martha, chef, we've done bread for 6 days. I know bread. I can recite the hydration percentages of a baguette in my sleep. Flour, water, salt, yeast. It's chemistry. I get it. Can we move on to something that requires skill?" Martha didn't answer. She reached into a large plastic bin and pulled out a mass of dough that had been fermenting overnight. It was alive, bubbling, shifting sluggishly like a sleeping creature. She slammed it onto the wooden counter. "Thwack. Knead," she commanded. Julian walked over. He cracked his knuckles. This was the part he hated most. In his restaurants, he had Hobart mixers the size of jet engines. They did the work. Here, Martha had banned the mixer. "The machine introduces heat," she had said. "The hands introduce soul." Julian grabbed the dough. It was cold and sticky, clinging to his fingers like aggressive glue. He attacked it. He dug the heels of his hands into the mass, pushing hard, stretching it out, then folding it back over. He worked with speed, with aggression. He wanted to dominate the gluten. He wanted to beat the proteins into submission, forcing them to align into the perfect network he had seen in textbooks. Push, tear, fold, slam. He was sweating within minutes. He treated the dough like a punching bag, channeling his frustration at the cold room, the early hour, and the silence of his phone which lay dead on the counter. "Stop!" Martha's voice cut through his exertion. Julian froze, panting. "What?" "I'm developing the window pane. I'm almost there." Martha walked over. She picked up a piece of his dough. It was tight, rubbery. When she pulled it, it didn't stretch. It snapped back, tearing with a jagged edge. "You are fighting it," she said softly. "Look at this. The gluten is tight. It is stressed. You are transferring your anger into the bread." "It's dough, Martha," Julian snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "It doesn't have feelings. It's biology. It needs kinetic energy to form chains." "It is alive," Martha countered, her voice dropping an octave. "It is a colony of millions of organisms. They breathe. They eat. If you beat them, they tighten up. Just like a person." She moved him aside with a hip check that was surprisingly strong. She placed her hands on the battered dough. She didn't push. She leaned. Julian watched, mesmerized despite his irritation. Martha's movements were oceanic. She rocked forward, using the weight of her body, not the muscles of her arms. She guided the dough, stretching it gently until it offered resistance, then folding it over with a caress. It was a dance. Rock, fold, turn. Rock, fold, turn. Under her hands, the dough changed. It relaxed. The surface went from craggy and torn to smooth and satiny. It stopped fighting. It began to breathe. "You treat the dough like an employee you need to fire," Martha murmured, her eyes half closed. "You must treat it like a partner you are trying to lead in a waltz. You wait for it to be ready. You listen to the tension." She stepped back. "Do it again. This batch goes to the pigs. It is too tough." Julian stared at the bin of wasted dough. "That's 5 kilos of flour." "Then stop wasting it," Martha said, walking away to check the oven. "Use your hands, Julian, not your ego." By mid-morning, the physical torture was replaced by social humiliation. 10 a.m. the rush began. Julian was assigned to the front counter. This, he felt, was a specific cruelty designed by Martha to break him. Julian Thorne did not serve coffee. He did not put muffins in bags. He designed menus. He conceived culinary experiences. But here he was, wearing the nameless apron, standing behind the glass case while Martha worked in the back. The bell jingled. A woman walked in, Mrs. Gable. She was a stern-faced librarian who wore thick glasses and a coat that smelled of mothballs. She came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 10:15. "Good morning," Julian said, flashing his charming TV smile, the one that usually melted hearts in the demographic of 18 to 34-year-olds. "Welcome to Martha's Hearth. Today we have a deconstructed lemon tart that acts as a delightful interplay between acidity and—" "I want 2 crullers," Mrs. Gable interrupted, not even looking at him. She was digging in her purse for exact change. "And tell Martha not to put them in the paper bag too early. The grease soaks through." Julian blinked. "Right. Crullers. Of course. But if I may suggest, the almond financier today has a texture that is really quite—" "Young man," Mrs. Gable peered at him over her spectacles. "Are you the one from the TV? The one who yelled at the oven?" Julian felt his face heat up. "Yes, I am Julian Thorne." "Well, Julian Thorne." She placed $3.50 on the counter. "I don't eat textures. I eat crullers. And I eat them because my husband loved them, and he's been dead for 10 years, and eating them is the only time I remember exactly what he smelled like. So put the crullers in the bag, and please stop trying to sell me a concept." Julian stood frozen. He looked at the woman, really looked at her. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. He saw the loneliness etched into the lines around her mouth. He silently used the tongs to pick up 2 crullers. Fried rings of dough, glazed with simple sugar, nothing fancy, nothing innovative. He placed them in the box, not the bag, lining it with wax paper so the grease wouldn't soak through. "Here you go, ma'am," he said quietly. "On the house today." Mrs. Gable looked at him, surprised. She took the box. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "You're learning." Slowly, she left. Julian leaned against the back counter, letting out a long breath. "She's a tough critic." A voice rumbled from the corner table. It was Henry. The old mayor was nursing his 3rd coffee, watching Julian with amusement. "They all are," Julian muttered, wiping the counter. "They don't want anything new. They just want the same thing every day. How do you create art when the audience refuses to be challenged?" Henry chuckled, a dry sound like leaves scraping pavement. "Art? You think Martha is making art? Isn't she?" Julian gestured to the kitchen. "She's a genius. She's Evelyn Vance. She could be making geometric sugar sculptures. Instead, she's making crullers." Henry stood up and walked over to the counter. He leaned in, his eyes twinkling. "Let me tell you something about those crullers, son. Back in '74, we had a blizzard. Shut the town down for a week. Power lines down. No heat. Martha kept that oven going with which she chopped herself. She made crullers because she ran out of yeast for bread. but she had flour and lard. She passed them out the window to the line crews working to restore the power. They were hot. They were sweet. They were the only warm thing any of us had eaten in 3 days. Henry tapped the glass display case. Mrs. Gable's husband was one of those linemen. He told her those crullers saved his life. Not because of the calories, but because they meant someone cared. Henry looked Julian in the eye. That's not art, Julian. That's utility. That's love made edible. You keep trying to impress people's brains. Martha feeds their stories. Until you understand the difference, you'll just be a tourist here. Julian looked down at the tray of crullers. They looked greasy. They looked uneven. But suddenly, they didn't look simple anymore. They looked heavy with history. Days turned into 2 weeks. The snow kept falling. Julian's resistance began to erode, not because he wanted it to, but because he was too tired to hold it up. The kitchen stripped him down. There was no room for pretense when you were scrubbing burnt caramel off a pot at noon or hauling 50-pound sacks of flour at dawn. He stopped trying to hack the system. He stopped looking for shortcuts. He stopped checking his phone. Mostly because the battery had died and he hadn't bothered to find the charger. He began to watch Martha differently. He stopped watching her hands for technique, the how, and started watching her eyes for the why. He noticed she smelled the milk before pouring it, checking its sweetness. He noticed she held the eggs for a second, warming them. He noticed she hummed when the brioche was rising, a low vibration that she claimed the dough enjoyed. One afternoon, during a lull, Martha handed him a bowl of sourdough starter. "Smell," she said. Julian leaned in. "It smells sour, yeasty, a bit like apples?" "Deeper," Martha commanded. Julian closed his eyes. He inhaled. "Vinegar, wet wood, and something sharp, like yogurt." "Good," Martha nodded. "The lactobacillus is active. It is hungry. If you use it now, the bread will be dense. It needs 2 more hours. It needs to digest." "How do you know?" Julian asked. "I mean, without the pH strips?" "Because it smells frantic," Martha said, walking away. "It smells like it is rushing. Bread should never rush." That night, Julian couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was oppressive. He went downstairs. The bakery was dark, illuminated only by the street lamp outside casting long, blue shadows across the floor. He walked to the intern station. The bin of dough sat there, the same simple country loaf recipe he had failed at for 14 days straight. Flour, water, salt, yeast. He washed his hands. The water was cold. He dried them. He opened the bin. The dough was there. He reached in. "Hello," he whispered. He felt ridiculous talking to flour, but Martha did it, so maybe there was something to it. He pulled the dough out. It was sticky, clinging to the wood. He took a breath. He didn't punch it. He didn't attack. "Waltz," she had said. He leaned forward. He caught the edge of the dough with his palm. He rocked. He felt the resistance, the gluten strands tightening. Instead of forcing through the resistance, he waited. He paused for a microsecond, letting the dough relax under his hand. Then he folded. Rock, wait, fold, rock, wait, fold. It was slow, agonizingly slow. His brain screamed at him to speed up, to be efficient. Time is money, covers per hour. But he silenced the voice. He focused on the tactile sensation. The dough was cool, but it was warming up from his hands. He could feel the gas bubbles popping gently under his fingers, little sighs of fermentation. He began to find a rhythm. It wasn't the frantic, staccato rhythm of a professional kitchen. It was the rhythm of a heartbeat. Loop-doop, rock-fold. He closed his eyes. He wasn't in Maplewood. He wasn't in New York. He was just in the dough. He felt the structure change. The stickiness vanished, replaced by a smooth, tacky skin that felt like a baby's cheek. It was holding together. It was strong but pliable. He opened his eyes. The dough was a perfect sphere, smooth and taut. He placed it in the proofing basket. He covered it with a linen cloth. And then he sat on the floor, his back against the oven, and waited. He didn't check the clock. He listened. He listened to the radiator clanking. He listened to the wind, and he imagined the millions of little yeast cells in that basket, eating the sugars, burping out carbon dioxide, pushing the flour matrix upward, fighting gravity. He fell asleep there, sitting on the floor, apron still on. He woke up to the smell. It wasn't the smell of burning. It wasn't the smell of raw yeast. It was the smell of toast, of nuttiness, of something ancient and fundamental. He jerked awake. Sunlight was streaming in. Martha was standing at the oven, pulling out a tray. On the tray was a single loaf of bread. It was his loaf. He knew it was his because of the clumsy scoring pattern he had slashed on top, a crooked wheat stalk. But the loaf itself, it was magnificent. It had sprung in the oven, tearing open at the score line to reveal the jagged, beautiful interior crumb. The crust was a deep, burnished chestnut color, singing with the crackling sound of cooling starch. Julian scrambled up, his legs numb. "You baked it. I found you sleeping," Martha said, not looking at him. "The dough was ready. It was calling, so I put it in." She placed the loaf on the cooling rack. The sound it made as it settled was hollow, a good drum-like thump. "Well?" Julian asked, his heart hammering in his chest. "How is it?" Martha picked up a serrated knife. She didn't saw at the bread. She drew the knife across it. The crust shattered with a sound like eggshells breaking. She cut a thick slice. Steam poured out, smelling of fermentation and earth. She looked at the crumb structure. It was open, airy, with irregular holes that caught the light. It wasn't the dense brick he had been making for 2 weeks. She tore off a piece of the crust and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. Julian held his breath. He had waited for Michelin stars with less anxiety than this. Martha swallowed. She looked at the bread, then at Julian. "It is bread," she said. Julian's face fell. "Just bread?" "Julian." Martha turned to him, and her expression was serious. "Do you know how hard it is to make bread that is just bread? To make something that doesn't try to be a brioche, doesn't try to be a cake, doesn't hide behind herbs or cheese. To make flour and water taste like the earth it grew in?" She handed him a slice. Julian took the warm slice. He didn't put butter on it. He bit into it. The crust was shattering glass. The inside was chewy, moist, with a tang of acid that made his mouth water. Tasted simple, but it was a complexity of simplicity. Tasted like the 3 hours of kneading. Tasted like the cold room. Tasted like patience. "It's good," Julian whispered. "It is honest," Martha corrected. "For the first time since you walked in here, you made something honest. You stopped trying to be Julian Thorne, the TV star. You were just a pair of hands helping the wheat be what it wanted to be." She walked back to her station and picked up her mug to measure flour for the morning biscuits. "Now," she said, her back to him, "clean up the intern station. You made a mess with the flour, and Henry will be here in 10 minutes. He likes the crusty end. Save it for him." Julian stood there, holding the slice of warm bread. A smile broke across his face. Not the practiced media smile, but a goofy, exhausted, genuine grin. "Yes, chef," he said. He ate the rest of the slice in 2 bites, feeling the warmth spread down to his toes. He grabbed the broom, the same broom he had used to sweep up his ego 2 weeks ago. The bell on the door jingled. Henry walked in, shaking snow off his coat. "Smells good in here." Henry sniffed the air. "Smells like real bread." Julian looked up from his sweeping. "Morning, Henry. I saved the heel for you." Henry looked at Julian, then at the loaf on the rack. He raised an eyebrow at Martha, who was hiding a small smile behind her flour bin. "Well, I'll be damned," Henry muttered, sitting down at his table. "Maybe the city boy is teachable after all." Julian didn't answer. He just kept sweeping, finding a rhythm in the swish-swish of the straw, listening to the silence, which, for the first time, didn't feel empty, felt full. The thaw in Maplewood did not announce itself with a trumpet blast, but with the slow, rhythmic dripping of icicles weeping from the eaves of Martha's hearth. It was April, the season the locals affectionately and ruefully called mud season. The pristine white blanket of winter had retreated, revealing the bruised, brown earth beneath, wet and heavy with the promise of life. The air had changed, too. It no longer carried the sharp, metallic bite of frost. Instead, it smelled of wet bark, awakening soil, and the faint, sweet perfume of maple sap boiling in the sugar shacks up in the hills. Inside the bakery, the light had shifted. The low, blue shadows of winter were replaced by a clear, hard spring sunshine that poured through the plate glass windows, exposing every scratch on the wooden floor and every speck of flour dancing in the air. Julian Thorne stood at the main workbench, his hands buried deep in a mound of brioche dough. He was no longer the shivering intern of February. His movements had lost their frantic, performative edge. He worked with a quiet economy, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing synchronized with the rocking motion of his palms against the wood. He wore a simple gray t-shirt dusted with white, and the name Julian was nowhere to be seen. To the town of Maplewood, he had simply become the guy who makes the morning buns. He paused, lifting the dough. It was silky, yellow with rich cultured butter, and trembling slightly. The structure was perfect. He didn't need to check a chart to know the gluten development was sufficient. He felt the tension in the dough, a subtle resistance that felt like a firm handshake. He placed it gently into the proofing tub and covered it with a linen cloth, patting it once, instinctively, as one might pat the shoulder of an old friend. "The humidity is up today." Martha's voice came from the oven area. She was sliding trays of galettes onto the cooling rack. "The flour is drinking more water." "I adjusted," Julian replied without turning around. "Added 20 grams to the hydration." "Felt thirsty." Martha paused, looking at his back. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone before it could be recorded. "Good," she said simply. "The rhubarb is coming in tomorrow. We'll need to prep the compote." "I'll sharpen the paring knives," Julian said. "Henry complained the crust on the tart was too thick yesterday. I think I overworked the short crust." "Henry complains when the sun is too bright," Martha chuckled. "But he was right. You have hot hands, Julian. You need to wash them in cold water before you touch the butter." It was a mundane conversation, the kind of shorthand dialogue shared by two people who spent their lives in the trenches of a kitchen. There was no ego in it, only the pursuit of the work. Julian felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling so alien to his previous life that he still sometimes woke up waiting for the anxiety to kick in, waiting for the ratings report or the call from his agent. But the phone didn't ring. The silence was his companion now, until, of course, the world came crashing back in. It started with a vibration, not the subtle tremor of a heavy truck, but the purring, deep bass vibration of a high-performance engine. Julian stopped wiping the counter. He looked out the window. A car was rolling slowly down the muddy main street, looking as out of place as a spaceship in a cornfield. It wasn't a production van this time. It was a Bentley Flying Spur, charcoal gray, gleaming with a predatory shine that repelled the dirt of the road. Julian's stomach tightened. He knew that car. The Bentley pulled up to the curb, disregarding the no parking sign just as the black van had done months ago. The driver's door opened, and a chauffeur stepped out to open the rear passenger door. A man emerged. He was dressed in a navy bespoke suit that cost more than the annual revenue of the bakery. He wore rimless glasses and had the kind of ageless, moisturized skin that came from weekly facials and a lack of empathy. "Elias?" Julian whispered, the rag in his hand suddenly feeling heavy. Elias Vane, the CEO of the Omnimedia Network. The man who had discovered Julian, polished him, and turned him into a brand. Elias didn't visit sets. Elias didn't leave his office in Hudson Yards unless he was acquiring a company or firing a star. The bakery door opened. The cheerful jingle of the bell sounded mocking this time. Elias stepped in, wrinkling his nose slightly at the smell of yeast, which he likely categorized as peasant food. He scanned the room, his eyes sliding over Henry, who was dozing in the corner, and landing on Julian. "Julian," Elias said, his voice smooth, cultivated, and utterly chilling. He opened his arms as if to embrace a prodigal son, but he didn't move his feet. "My God, look at you. You look authentic." Julian didn't move from behind the counter. He felt exposed without his chef's white jacket, stripped of his armor. But then he glanced down at his flour-dusted apron and realized he was wearing a different kind of armor. "Elias," Julian said, his voice steady. "You're a long way from the city. We were worried, Julian." Elias walked forward, avoiding a patch of sunlight as if he were allergic to it. The crew came back with disturbing footage. A breakdown. Collapse. "We thought you were having a mental health crisis. We were preparing a press release." "I'm fine," Julian said. "I'm just baking." "So I see." Elias reached the counter and placed a manicured hand on the glass, right above the cinnamon rolls. "But the sabbatical is over. The sponsors are getting restless. And frankly, the narrative is too good to waste." "What narrative?" Elias smiled, a shark baring its teeth. "The redemption, Julian. The monk chef. We have the footage of you failing. We have the footage of you sweeping the floor. It's gold. We re-edit the season. You aren't the arrogant judge anymore. You are the fallen king who retreated to the wilderness to find his soul. We film you here in this charming hovel. We film you learning from the grandma. And then, in the season finale, you return to New York, triumphant, combining your Michelin skills with this rustic wisdom. It will be the highest-rated season in food television history." Julian felt a wave of nausea. Elias was taking the most painful, honest months of his life and turning them into a plot point. He was turning Martha into a prop. "No," Julian said. Elias blinked, as if Julian had spoken a foreign language. "Excuse me?" I said no. "I'm not going back. And you aren't filming here." Elias chuckled. A low, dismissive sound. "Julian, look at this place." He waved a hand around the room. "The paint is peeling. The floor is warped. You are Julian Thorne. You belong on a stage, not buried in Vermont making muffins for senior citizens. You have a contract. You have obligations. And frankly, you have a lifestyle to maintain. How long until your savings run out? 6 months? A year?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And let's be honest. This is cute. It's a nice vacation. But you are a Ferrari parked in a mule shed. Eventually, you're going to want to drive fast again." Julian looked at his hands. He looked at the burn scar on his arm from the oven rack, a fresh one from last week. He looked at the flour under his fingernails. Was Elias right? Was he just playing pretend? Was this just another role he was acting out until the applause started again? "He isn't going anywhere." A voice cut through the tension. Martha walked out from the kitchen. She wasn't wiping her hands today. She stood tall, her posture rigid, her eyes dark and unreadable. She walked around the counter and stood next to Julian. She didn't look at Elias. She looked at the space between them. "Ah, the mysterious Martha." Elias smiled, turning his charm on her. "Or should I say, Chef Vance? My researchers did a wonderful job digging up your file. The White House, the disappearance. It adds a wonderful layer of mystery to the show. We can offer you a consultancy fee, of course. A very generous one." "Get out of my shop," Martha said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the density of cast iron. "Now, let's be reasonable." Elias pulled a folded document from his inner pocket. "I'm prepared to offer a location fee that would allow you to renovate this entire building. New ovens, new floors." "I like my floors," Martha interrupted. "They remember every step I've taken." She turned to Julian. The room seemed to shrink, fading Elias out until it was just the two of them. "Julian," she said softly, "do you know why I left Washington?" Julian shook his head. "No, the legends say you burned out, or you had a fight with the First Lady." "Legends," Martha scoffed gently. "I left because of a strawberry." Elias rolled his eyes, checking his Rolex. "Oh God, here comes the parable." Martha ignored him. It was June 1990, a state dinner for the Soviet Union. The Cold War was thawing. It was the most important meal of the decade. I was making a strawberry bavarois. I had the best strawberries flown in from California. I tasted one. It was red. It was juicy. But when I ate it, I tasted nothing. She looked at her hands, the hands that had fed presidents. I tried another. Nothing. Panicked. I thought I was having a stroke. I ate a spoonful of sugar. Tasted like sand. I drank lemon juice. Tasted like water. I realized then that I hadn't lost my sense of taste physically. I had lost my soul's ability to taste. I had been cooking for cameras, for politics, for approval, for so long that the connection between my heart and my tongue had been severed. I was a machine. A very good, very expensive machine. She looked up at Julian, her eyes piercing him. I walked out of the kitchen that night. I left the Bavarois half-finished. I drove north until I ran out of gas. I ended up here. Took me 2 years of baking simple bread, just flour and water, before I could taste a strawberry again. 2 years to remember that I was a human being, not a brand. She reached out and took Julian's hand. Her skin was rough, warm, and real. Elias is right about one thing, Julian. You are a Ferrari. You are fast. You are brilliant. But if you go back with him now, you will never taste anything again. You will spend the rest of your life eating sand and pretending it is sugar. Julian looked at the Bentley outside. He thought about his penthouse. He thought about the roar of the crowd. Then he looked at the proofing tub of brioche. He thought about the smell of the yeast. He thought about Mrs. Gable eating her cruller. He thought about the silence of the morning, the heavy, beautiful silence where he could finally hear his own thoughts. He realized he wasn't afraid of losing his fame. He was afraid of losing his taste. Julian turned to Elias. He didn't look angry. He looked sad, the way one looks at a child who doesn't understand why he can't touch the fire. Elias, Julian said, you can't afford me. Elias laughed. A sharp, incredulous bark. I can't afford you? Julian, I can write a check right now that would buy this entire town. No. Julian shook his head. You deal in money. You deal in attention. But the currency here is different. The currency here is time. And you don't have enough of it. You want the redemption arc in 42 minutes of television. It took Martha 2 years to taste a strawberry. It might take me 10. I can't rush the dough, Elias. And I can't rush myself. You're making a mistake. Elias snapped, his veneer of politeness cracking. You're walking away from millions. You're walking away from your legacy. In 6 months, they will forget your name. I hope so, Julian smiled. It was the first time he had truly smiled at Elias in 5 years. I really hope so, because then I can just be the baker. He reached behind the counter, grabbed a brown paper bag, and used the tongs to pick up a warm cinnamon roll. He folded the top of the bag and held it out to the CEO. For the road, Julian said. It's on the house. Elias stared at the bag as if it contained a bomb. He looked at Julian, seeing the resolve in his eyes, a resolve that no contract could break. He sneered, snatched the bag, and spun on his heel. You're a fool. Thorne, Elias shouted as he stormed out. A rustic, pathetic fool. The door slammed. The bell jingled violently, then stilled. Through the window, they watched the chauffeur open the door. Elias threw the bag into the back seat and climbed in. The Bentley reversed, tires spinning in the mud for a second before catching traction, and sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust that quickly dissipated in the crisp spring air. The silence returned. But it wasn't empty. It was full of the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, and the breathing of the dough. Julian leaned against the counter, letting out a breath he felt he had been holding for a decade. His knees felt weak. You gave him the cinnamon roll, Martha observed, her voice returning to its usual dry tone. Yeah, that was the last one from the morning batch. I know. It was a bit dry, Martha critiqued. You left it in the oven 2 minutes too long. Julian laughed. It started as a chuckle and grew into a belly laugh, a sound of pure release that echoed off the brick walls. I guess he'll write a bad review on Yelp. He will eat it, Martha said, walking back to her station. And he will realize what he is missing. That is the worst punishment for a man like that. Henry Henderson, who had been feigning sleep the entire time, opened one eye. Is it safe? Is the vampire gone? He's gone, Henry, Julian said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Good, Henry grunted, sitting up and adjusting his cap. Because I need a refill. And don't think just because you turned down $1 million that you can slack off on the coffee service. Julian walked over to the coffee pot. He poured a fresh cup, black, steaming. He brought it to the table and set it down. Henry, Julian asked, pulling up a chair and sitting down opposite the old man. Do you think I'm a fool? Henry blew on his coffee, looking out the window at the muddy street where the snowdrops were just pushing their green heads through the earth. A fool is a man who plants wheat in the winter and expects a harvest, Henry said. You're just a man who finally realized what season it is. Julian looked over at Martha. She was back at the bench, her hands moving rhythmically, shaping the loaves for the afternoon bake. She paused, catching his eye. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, a microscopic dip of her chin, and pointed a flour-dusted finger at the clock. Time to work. Julian stood up. He walked back to the kitchen. He went to the sink and washed his hands, the cold water shocking his skin, waking him up. He dried them on his nameless apron. He walked to the proofing tub. He lifted the lid. The brioche dough had risen. It was puffy, golden, and smelled of sweet fermentation. It was ready. He plunged his hands into the dough, feeling the warmth, the life, the infinite potential of the simple ingredients. He wasn't Julian Thorne, the star. He wasn't the intern. He was just a pair of hands, serving the bread, in a quiet room in Maplewood, where the sugar tasted like sugar, and the silence tasted like home. He began to shape the first loaf. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the mud turned into earth, ready for the seeds of spring.